Welcome to Mummies of Ancient... The mummification process used by ancient Egyptians was highly ceremonial in nature. The different types of mummification took into account the social level and richness of the deceased and even included animals. The most expensive was that reserved for the pharaoh and the royal family, as well as some of the wealthiest members of the court. The first step was cleaning. Once bodies arrived at the mummification site, they were placed on inclined tables while the bodily fluids drained away. They were then cleansed by priests until they were deemed ready for the purification process.
Los manoseaban todos, en definitiva, la práctica. Luego hacer la limpieza. En la sala donde realizan la purificación, colocaban un embudo en el orificio anal de la persona para así hacer una profunda limpieza. Qué gracioso. El paso de la limpieza. En la sala donde realizaban la modificación colocaban el cuerpo en una mesa inclinada para drenar los fluidos corporales. Claro. Después los sacerdotes lo limpiaban y lo preparaban para proceder por un calor. Ok. Si tula, no sí a la tula.
The purification of the body began with a libation from sacred water. The priest then fumigated the body with terebinth resin. After the ritual cleansing, priests used oils, spices, and all kinds of essences to further purify the body of the deceased. Finally, all body hair was meticulously removed.
No. Pero.
Once the body was properly purified, embalmers removed the organs, following very specific procedures. First, the brain was extracted by inserting a spoon through the nostril to break the ethmoid bone. Then, using a spatula, the pieces of the brain were removed as thoroughly as possible. What matter remained was extracted after a process of liquefaction, achieved through the use of a caustic liquid. The cranial box, once emptied, was rinsed and disinfected with palm wine, and then stuffed with strips of linen cloth and liquefied resin.
No es loco, ¿para qué? No, aquí dejen el cerebro, ¿o no?
After taking care of the brain, embalmers made an incision on the left flank and carefully set aside the viscera. The inside of the body was also rinsed with palm wine. Then the embalmers filled the belly with pure myrrh, cinnamon, and other perfumes and sewed it shut. The removed viscera were washed in palm wine and packed in crushed herbs before being placed in canopic jars. Canopic jars were placed close to the sarcophagus or kept in a chest nearby. At first, the viscera were wrapped in tissue and placed in the vases. As the ritual requirements became more elaborate, ointments, spices, and even water and natron were added to the process. Towards the middle of the New Kingdom, canopic jars assumed the appearance of the four sons of Horus. They were known as the protectors of the Viscera. These protectors had their own guardians, each a goddess of the dead. Imseti, the human-headed god, protected the liver and was protected by the goddess Iset. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, protected the lungs and was protected by the goddess Memphis. Dumut-F, the jackal-headed god, protected the stomach and was protected by the goddess Neith. And finally, Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed god, protected the intestines and was protected by the goddess Selket. Natron is a naturally occurring mineral found in evaporite. These sedimentary rocks are made up of mineral salts and were generally mined from lake beds in Egypt.
Son minerales sal incolora, que se encuentran en las evaporitas. Estas rocas sedimentarias están compuestas por sales minerales y se extraían de los lechos de los lagos de Egipto. No, mira, lleno de natrón. Lleno de quistelol.
Embalmers used natron as a desiccant to dry the flesh and stop the corpse's putrefaction process. Once the body was cleansed and eviscerated, the deceased was covered in natron for about 40 days. Once desiccated, the body was prepared to be wrapped in strips of linen.
Por falta de renderización, boludo. A ver, halladura. Subido
Once the body was fully desiccated by the natron treatment, embalmers oiled, painted, and sometimes even added hair extensions or a wig. They often used a henna-based antiseptic preparation to give the body a more colorful and lively appearance while preparing it to resist molds and fungi. Next came the phase which gave mummies their most well-known appearance, the wrapping. Originally, each part of the body was wrapped separately. Men had their arms crossed on their chests, while women had the right arm folded over their breasts and the left arm stretched along the body. However, techniques evolved over time. Eventually, the body as a whole was wrapped with limbs alongside the body, and increasingly sophisticated and different techniques of weaving flax bands were developed.
Mirá, amigo, es un hombre. What the fuck? What the fuck, amigo?
In addition to the jewelry and amulets arranged on the skin of the deceased, amulets were also carefully inserted into the weaving of the linen strips. Each amulet was linked to a myth, or to an ideological belief related to rebirth. Masks were an important part of a mummy's finery. Early wooden funeral coverings were very expensive, however, and soon replaced by masks created through a technique known as cartonnage. Masks fashioned with this method were created by laying several layers of linen or papyrus pulp on a base made of mud or straw. Cartonnage was used for more than funerary masks. Ornaments and the animal coffins of the late period were also made in such a fashion. Cartonnage evolved to cover the entire body of the mummy during the 22nd dynasty. The mummies were placed on a board inside a rigid envelope of cartonnage, which was laced at the back with a string. Extremely cost-effective and visually pleasing, this technique was very popular through all layers of the society.
Mira. Sí, soy bien. Por esto.
Cartonnage envelopes were usually covered with inscriptions and polychrome decorations, specifying the names and titles of the deceased, scenes depicting daily life, or decorations specific to the funerary world. This was a true gift for Egyptologists eager to study the funerary rites of the ancient Egyptians. Once the mummy was properly wrapped and adorned, the embalmers proceeded with the ceremony of the opening of the mouth. A vital step of the funerary process, this ceremony was meant to bring back to life the deceased themselves, or an object representing the deceased. There were no less than 75 different stages for the opening of the mouth. It required the application of the same oils, ointments, spices, and perfumes used during the mummification process. Makeup was sometimes part of the process as well. The last stage of this long ritual was the act of touching the mouth with the adze to symbolically allow the breath of life to infuse an inert body. Its performance was reserved for a very specific set of people: priests who wore the mask of the god Anubis, a close relative of the family, or by the heir to the throne. The last stage of this long ritual was the act of touching the mouth with the adze to
La importancia de las LOL. ¡Oh, Dios! A un tiro de piedra. El faro tardó 12.000 años en construirse y está hecho principalmente de calizos. Digo, los suyos estaban entre los mejores vidrieros del mundo. Plutarco, Cleopatra valaba más de 1 idiomas que capa. Coger prestando un barco. Puedes coger si prestas un barco en el barrio Santiago. En Napoleón de Egipto, Tutmosis III llevó a cabo 8 campañas contra la homofobia. Fuera de todo su tiempo.
Welcome to The Importance of Mummies. The first hieroglyph for embalmer appeared in pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom. It is likely that embalming was a trade that progressed alongside the evolution of ancient Egyptian funeral practices. While we still know nothing of how embalming came to be a profession, we do know that embalmers had a hierarchy, and that each embalmer specialized in a specific phase of the mummification process.
Mirá, está metiendo el cada parte está en cada jarrón. Cada uno. Qué piola, mira.
The mummification techniques were jealously guarded by embalmers from generation to generation. Despite their efforts, Herodotus and Diodorus discovered their methods in late antiquity, but historians were skeptical about the validity of the texts. It remained a mystery until two teams of modern medical legal scientists confirmed the process in 1994 and again in 2011. The Uabet, meaning the pure place, was where the embalmers mummified the bodies of the deceased. Until the end of the Middle Kingdom, it was located in tents at the edges of the city due to the smell of decomposition. In the New Kingdom, however, the Uabet was located within the city limits, though still in open-air spaces. In the same way that the practices and techniques of mummification evolved, so possibly did consideration towards embalmers within ancient Egyptian society. The pharaoh had access to the most elaborate of mummification rituals. The richer citizens of Egypt also enjoyed complex embalming options, though none of them allowed for the removal of the brain or viscera. After purifying the body, embalmers injected a liquid through the rectum, sealed it, and allowed the mixture to settle. They then plunged the body into natron for up to 40 days. Once the body was dried, the seal was removed, and the entrails flowed out with the injected liquid, leaving the skin and bones of the deceased to be wrapped in linen and returned to the family for burial. The least costly embalming option was for the embalmers to simply inject a product called surmaya and immerse the body in the natron for up to 40 days before handing it over to the family. For all those who could not afford any embalming process, desert burials offered a pauper's alternative to preserve the bodies of the dead. Egyptian civilization has always appealed to Westerners, even before the Greek and Roman invasions. As early as the Middle Ages, mummies discovered by travelers were often sent back to Europe. Curio cabinets, dating from the 16th and 17th centuries, usually included pharaonic artifacts in their collections. The Egyptomania phenomenon was heralded by Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign, which lasted from 1798 to 1802. The following years were marked by a resurgence of interest from rich enthusiasts and scholars who exposed Egypt to the general populace. Many research societies focusing on Egyptology were founded during those years. By 1868, mass tourism began in Egypt under the aegis of the Cook Agency. The rich would indulge in leisure trips to Egypt and bring back mummies. Upon their return, they would organize evenings that consisted of unpacking mummies and removing strips of linen and amulets layer by layer. These were considered the shining cultural events of the season. The Egyptian collections of many a museum were founded as a consequence of this mass pillaging.
Investigar entonces si se van a profanar. Básicamente perturbaron los cuerpos que habían sido embalsamados tan cuidadosamente, ¿no? Joder, claro. Qué pena. Pero si no hubiésemos hecho eso no seríamos nada hoy en día.
Thanks to those dubious parties, the fantasy of a mummy coming back to life, seeking revenge on its defilers, was born. The mummy malediction myth has remained steady in popular culture ever since, particularly in written media and cinema.
Ya lol, a ver. Montaña verde.
Πού καλώς έχει. Ανέρι τε και γίνω, ου και ξεμπορήν με τα βάσαν εκτιά μου. Ευλαβαίος αυτού φέρει. Αν ερτέουτος κοβέκαον μοναδελφότη τη ρίγνητο. Ούτι πλέον ήμεον κόμιν δε διούνε, αλέω θεωρούς θεγέ, εξωστρακιστής νέων ξυνικήσεως. Πόρεων αγγέλρες ματιούτων, ευλαβήσε στο καλέο μόν, αντίλιον πέρας γάρ ουακι ενδύνος τρίβων ουν έστι. κοιλάδαν γελιστέοι κατατρέχουσιν. Η κλαπίσιν, η μη φωνεύσεων ημών. Έτι δίσε, σύνοιν ταξέδου τριβήν. Κρήτον ασφελός, η μεταγιγνώσκη.
Κομισέι, εκείκο! Αντίπατρος και αρσινόη, χωρίου διορίγματος έγκυς ζητήν, θελούσιους επικουρίντες με λιδαίων συγκομιδείς, και γιγονένεους ευφυγήσουσιν, βρόσιντε και ίνεου ορίστεση ρευσούνε προς πάντουσι παραστάτε.
Ζήνων, χορ ζήνεου ιός, δραχμένων πάνη διατίθεστε δούνε, παραπαλαίωσιν προσχήματα μόν.
Πορήλετε, η δήματα προσώπατα των εσκλίων. Κυβερνή του οίκιος κενός και λευτικός έχει. Πολλό χρόνου υστέρων. Καθεξίου μηνώσγε αδελφερίστε μέλη.
Προσήχουν πάνη.
Αγγέλευσμα χαρίεν γαρέστηνε, συμποσίου κρίτονος παγρόντος και λεύσκης, εστοτέων ανδέρων σολέιν επικαλεύσει.
Πράγματα την αδύνατονες,
μακραία
λάξο
και
κόσμο και
τρίβισμένην ανά των πύλεων.
ληξίσας είναι αυτήν, αρχόν να ονε.
Πορήλετε,
Ιδιότην,
έκικο,
ώραν βουλήμη τη μηχανέστην να
την
εξελεύθεις.
καύτην αφικνέονται.
Αμαξιτών
Είναι
και
εκθυσιές
αγγελεύσματος.
των πράξεσιν.
Αριστόδικος γένων και
Αναγνωστείτε
συντάζεστε
επί
γάρτα
χρεσβαίων παρημών.
τριών ουν νεογούν
Καλέων
κάνουλων τε
της
και
οικεσιν
τετρακίσων όλων
εξευθύνεται
αποδώστε
και
βούλη.
φιλοφροσένης κόμις τέουτης
Δευτέρα και
ευιόρων.
ξερωμένη σε
Πάντα
βυσκέφερ.
όνειρα.
Γεροσκόπου
Κράτη
πάντα,
θα είσαι.
χαριστήριο αφελοστού.
Αυτό γαμού διαδιαούτα η κασούσασα. Απορρίψην αυτόν
Ούσι
ιερωμένη,
οίκον και
αυτόν
χαρίεν
ευτοκτόνησε.
οικοδομίζεστε.
Όταν
αγγέλοι
ιδιωτικός
ανέρος
ιδιώτας εντάνταν η
Τους
φάσας.
Θεούς ζητούνε
Πιλότας,
διέπισεν
φορτίου
προς
ιός,
ισοτομέου δι
μάρμαρο ου,
δευθύνε.
δίστε κατέσου.
Σου ένα κόμιγαρ γιγάνεο έλικιον εκδομήσετε τάχα. Αγγελεύσεντο έκτιον παντός τενέτεου παρεδόσεως ονίζεστε μέλη. Ήθιμε γε πόνου πράξεσεν. Ανέρετε και γίνεται το Θεό πνεύει πίστιον και λεύσματι γράφτου ο νεό έσχο. Εορτάν πνεύει προβελήσετε όπως και ρημπαίνου σχέδιον. Ου πότου ασθενές τάφρον. Ελπίς έστεσεν το όντι Θεόν, χαλεπέας υγιήνε παραβλέπεσονται και ευχαρίνε ήμων.
Ανθρώπεοι, πες, μεστέριον γε επελέληθε.
Απολύτως ηρή.
Welcome to Amulets and Rituals.
Εξαμείνεστε, παρατέου, πάντες ημών χρόνου διαθέντων εκουσίως επί του ρήνθη. Ήθιγε, πλέον γύρας κρήτων έσετε.
Ancient Egyptians believed the world was a chaotic place, filled with supernatural forces. They knew that art and words gave life and power to things. Carved with images from hieroglyphs or in the shapes of gods, amulets were highly personal objects that warded off dangers and disease while attracting success. Some amulets were temporary, intended to solve a specific problem, while others were meant to be worn forever into the afterlife.
Κόμις ανθρώποι νυνδυνάντε έως συγκομίδιν καρυβό.
Priests would infuse amulets with magical energy during religious ceremonies, imbuing them with protective magic to safeguard against supernatural powers. The wealthiest of Egyptians could obtain a divinely ordained pendant in which was hidden a magic formula inscribed on a piece of papyrus. It would act as a unique spell tailored to the owner. Religion was so important to ancient Egyptians that it permeated every aspect of their daily lives. Since water was the source of life and had the symbolism of purifying the body and the soul, all daily routines began with ablutions. Personal prayers to the gods were sometimes written or spoken, with family prayers passed down through generations. There was a complete calendar of each of the religious days, both good and bad, illustrating the appropriate daily rituals. Along with wine, milk, and ointments, offerings to the gods consisted of small amulets to life-size statues and family shrines. During the Greco-Roman period, offerings to the gods consisted of mummified animals, cats for Bastet, dogs for Anubis, and birds for Thoth.
Τον οικοδεσπότην δε μάλλον.
Γάρπεδα δεν πάνω πατάξαν δε. Νίξαν αυτό χρήζει.
Χάριν έχει αγαθή ψυχή. Χάριν έχει.
Μόνο και ο βυρμόνι τους της εμφάνει αρκετών εστιγά. Το κτίνος κρυπάται.
Ευχαριστώ το Θεό, ότι φιλάνθρωπος εστί. Μοίρα ευμενής. Ευχαριστώ.
Deemed messengers of the gods, oracles offered guidance and judgment for all Egyptians, regardless of status. Crucial advice was offered on everything from day-to-day farming management to a pharaoh's decision on whether to start a war. Oracles were often used to decide legal issues. If the accused refused the judgment of the god, another god could be consulted in hopes of a more favorable reply.
Εις την εξέδωσες.
Ευλογείτε σε Θεή.
Ότι σ' αγαθός. Χαίρετε τα του οίκου σου. Ουφ, επέρασε. Εγλίτωσε.
Αγαθόν έστικα τους πλησίους εκβοηθάτε.
Μοίρα ευμενής ευρήκε με. Ευχαριστώ, Θεή.
Όταν η μοντά της πράξεως εγίνατο, ευχιάρη.
Ο άνθρωπε αγαθέ, ου μόνον Αθηνά θείο, αλλά και χείρα κύριε.
Οι μάκαρες φιλούσιμε και φύλαξαν.
Ευχαριστώ το Θεό.
Χάριν έχε. Αγαθόν έστικα τους πλησίους εκβοηθάτε. Ευχάριστος η μητά σου. Όταν η μορτά της πράξεως εγίνατο, ευχαίρει. Θάνατη, δοκιμάζω συμφωνητής δοκιμασίες, εμποδίνες. Πηγαίνω το μέγα σφάλμα. Πάψταστε, πάρα αυτά. Τα τέκνα χτυπατάξει εννοείται. Ετρόπια αυτή. Ο εξάλλου μηνύ.
It was oracles that guided the Greek sailor Batos to the coast of Libya, where he founded a colony known as Cyrene. During Alexander the Great's campaign to conquer Persia, he consulted the oracle at the Temple of Amun within the oasis of Siwa, and was subsequently ordained a divine being. Welcome to Temples and Rituals. During rituals and festivals, the god was carried on a solar barge between the areas of a temple or the temples of different cities. Funerary carvings and paintings covering thousands of years, as well as the Book of the Dead, depict the same ship and oar design. Solar barges have been uncovered near or within several pharaohs' tombs. They were intended to carry the pharaoh into the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians believed that Ra, the sun god, traveled the skies in a boat known as the solar barge. The solar barge was believed to cross over to mythological lands. The god Ra believed mankind was conspiring against him. He ordered Sekhmet, the lion-headed war goddess, to kill all humans. To his chagrin, Ra quickly realized that with all humans gone, there would be no one left to worship him. In order to stop the rampaging Sekhmet, beer was brewed and dyed red with pomegranate juice to resemble blood. Sekhmet drank every drop of the brew she could find, eventually passing out drunk. When she awoke, she was calmer, and her lion visage had changed into Bastet. The Festival of Drunkenness was celebrated in honor of that myth. Unlike the daily rituals that took place in the temple and were performed by priests, festivals allowed the entire population of the city to participate. Festivals helped mark the passing of the seasons in the agricultural calendar. In reflecting the cycles of life, festivals offered a sense of consistency and structure for the regular citizens, thus reinforcing the sense of order that pharaohs were to provide for the citizens of Egypt as part of their godly duties. The importance of these festivals is demonstrated by their longevity. Records show that Osiris festivals occurred for more than 2,000 years. Some festivals serve to reinforce state control and promote the king's reign. Both the Opet and Set Jubilee festivals were specifically intended to celebrate the renewal of the king's power. The temple hierarchy consisted of high priests, several types of priests, scribes, and servants. The high priest was known as the prophet. Some divinities had up to 4 prophets, and they were the ones to perform the most advanced and complex rituals. Egyptian priests were not confined to solely religious tasks, and in fact had crucial roles in Egypt's administration, most of which served to reaffirm the pharaoh as the proper vessel for the gods. Their focus within the temple was centered on the proper conduct of daily divine rituals. rather than as custodians of dogma or the indoctrination of individuals. Scribes were custodians of the sacred sciences. Some priests were associated with the funeral rites and were considered the group with medical knowledge. The servants of the Ka were low-ranking priests who carried food and offerings in funerary rituals. Lector priests were distinguished by their ability to read, and their main duty was to recite specialized religious texts in both temple and funerary rituals. Priests and all the officials who served the temple worked only 3 months a year, with each period separated by a quarter of inactivity, at least within the temple compound. Each outgoing group handed over the temple and their tools to the newcomers. Only the high priesthood remained in permanent office within the temple. The most sacred part of the temple was referred to as Jesser Jesseru, the Holy of Holies. The most sacred inner sanctuary was where the shrine to the temple deity was located. Only priests were allowed within. Offerings were given, and rituals unseen by even the pharaoh were performed. While the team chose to allow any character access to this space in some game temples, normally it was reserved for priests alone. Pharaohs and their priests often chose the site of these sacred temples because of some mythological connection or an alignment with the cardinal points and certain stars. Once selected, a foundation ritual was performed. The pharaoh was required to complete 10 steps in the ritual, which required a mix of offerings as well as specific construction techniques. Once the temple was complete, construction of the chamber containing the shrine, or naos, began. Pharaohs and their priests often chose the site of these sacred temples. The most sacred part of the temple was referred to as Jesser Jesseru, the Holy of Holies. The most sacred inner sanctuary was where the naos was where the god statue stood. The representation of the deity was usually in stone or wood and decorated with gold, silver, and precious stones. Smaller temples had only one naos, while larger complexes, such as the Temple of Karnak, had many chambers to honor gods, such as Amun, Ptah, and Osiris. Each statue was believed to be a receptacle for the presence or essence of the god's Ka, enabling it to take a physical form. Through the statue, the god came to the shrine to eat, drink, and communicate with the pharaoh, or with the priests standing in for the pharaoh.
Sí, me encantó el ser de Unity, amigo. El soundtrack de ese juego uno muy especial, la verdad. Bueno, gente, ya.
Welcome to Temples and Priests.
Ok,
From its foundation, the city of Memphis favored worship of the god Ta. The main temple of Ta was known as Hutkapta, meaning Palace of the Ka of Ta. The name of the temple, translated into Greek as Aegyptos, would eventually evolve into the modern name Egypt.
no. ¿Qué está también aquí otras? Bueno, apagamos este mando.
Temples were the center of religious, political, and economic life in ancient Egypt. These sacred places were viewed as the literal home of the gods and goddesses. As such, every aspect of them required care and reverence, all of which was accomplished through elaborate ritual. Located in the center of Memphis, the Temple of Ta was the most prominent and imposing building in the city. The long walkway leading toward the temple, known as the Dromos, was guarded by rows of sphinxes. The entire sacred area was designed to keep the statue of the god protected, deep within the sacred enclosures that surrounded it. The Dromos opened into a courtyard, with the surrounding portico graced with columns carved to resemble palm trees. During special festivals, the general population was allowed to enter this location, but under no circumstances would they be allowed into the sacred spaces beyond the courtyard. The Memphis Alabaster Sphinx was discovered in 1912, almost completely buried in water and sand. 8 meters in height and weighing in at roughly 90 tons, it is still mounted on its original pedestal. Though it is called the Alabaster Sphinx, It was in fact carved from common calcite rock, which is similar in appearance and texture to alabaster.
Imposible, amigo. O sea, 8 metros. Subiría esto comparado. Es imposible, 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 imposible. Nada que ver. Es decir, por ejemplo, la reja de atrás de ese fondo, nada. Nada que ver, boludo. No, what the fuck, boludo. 8 metros, sí, sí. Sí, sí. Digo más yo que...
Erosion has destroyed the original engravings, making it difficult to determine when it was created. Egyptologists believe that its facial likeness resembles Amenhotep II, and so it could have been sculpted somewhere between 1700 and 1400 BCE. It is believed that this monument once stood outside of the Temple of Tao and was integrated into subsequent extensions to the complex. Erosion has destroyed. The Memphis Alabaster Sphinx was discovered in 1912, almost completely buried in water and sand. The size of the imposing sculpture reflects the importance it had to the temple during the New Kingdom. This Sphinx is one of the few remaining artifacts from the ruins of Memphis to survive. In Egyptian culture, some animals were associated with gods, while others were considered to be living gods. The Opus Bull was believed to be a divine entity. The earliest mention of the Opus Bull in ancient Egypt goes back as far as the first Egyptian dynasty. Originally the symbol of fertility, the Opus Bull was linked to the god Ra, with the image of the sun carried between its horns. Later it was associated with Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, thus becoming the funerary divinity Osiris. During the 18th dynasty in Memphis, the Opus Bull's association with the city's deity earned it the title Herald of Ptah. The Opus Bull was so revered that even Alexander the Great, upon his arrival in Memphis, gave honor to Opus. The Opus Bull lived with its harem in a sacred barn located in an enclosure in the Temple of Tao. Each bull bore 29 signs representative of its divinity. Among them, the bull had an eagle-shaped mark on its back, a double tail hair, and a scarab-shaped mark under the tongue. The signs were intended to correspond with the lunar cycle. After its death, Egyptians would search for its reincarnated form among the livestock.
sé, pero en cualquier caso yo no me ve nadie, boludo. No me bañaría. ¿Quién me ve como para que me bañe? Niga, negro. Que va, iban a probar, boludo.
Like other living divinities, the mortal incarnation of the Opus Bull was prayed to, and when it died, it was given a luxurious funeral, which included mummification. Until the reign of Ramses II, the Opus Bulls were buried in individual graves in Saqqara. During the 26th dynasty, the bodies of the bulls were buried in enormous stone vats in the underground corridors of the Serapeum of Memphis. Ancient Egyptians believed that temple rituals were essential to maintain order in the cosmos and allow communication between humans and gods. The pharaoh was required to bring offerings as part of a twofold promise made to the gods, to remain a just ruler and to prevent chaos from entering Egypt. Details of the ceremonies found on temple walls provide a thorough overview of the stages of the daily ritual. Performed 3 times a day to mirror human mealtimes, each step of the highly symbolic ceremony was accompanied by specific recitations, many of which referred to mythical events. The high priest would first awaken the sleeping god with a chant. Then the seals of the shrine's doors were broken and the bolts drawn back. The act of swinging open the doors was a symbolic gesture where sight was granted to the deity. The priest would then bow and kiss the ground. The god was then washed with incense-infused water and its mouth rinsed with mineral salts. The cleansing was followed by adorning the statue with jewels and royal garments. The final ritual required the priest to sweep away any footprints in order to prevent evil from approaching the god. Heredity was the primary source of new recruits. Rarely was an outsider allowed this position. At the top of the temple hierarchy was the high priest. Each temple dedicated to a god had at least one high priest devoted to its care and service. During the Ptolemaic dynasty, one family held the position of high priest in Memphis for almost 300 years. high priest candidates made their way up the ranks of the temple hierarchy. The one chosen to occupy the lofty position of high priest was usually confirmed by the pharaoh. Several of the high priests were also important officials in the government. Families sharing the highest priesthood titles tended to make many alliances, thereby gaining more land and wealth. Shifting balances of power sometimes resulted in more or less open conflicts between the priesthood and the pharaohs. High priest candidates made their way up the ranks of the temple hierarchy. The one chosen to occupy the lofty position of high priest. In the 21st dynasty, Thebes became the capital of an almost entirely theocratic government. The city was headed by king priests who spoke and governed in the name of the god Amun, in open opposition to the ruling pharaohs. These king priests caused a massive decentralization of power, known as the Third Intermediate Period. The educational institution in ancient Egypt was known as the House of Life. Attended by the offspring of the elite and the clergy, it was a place tailored to the social status of its attendees. The earliest references to this type of institution date back to royal decrees of the Old Kingdom. Only two known centers have been uncovered, one in the abandoned city of Akhetaten, and one at the Temple of Ramses II on the west bank of Thebes. Inscriptions uncovered in those locations mention the names and titles of people who were connected with the House of Life, such as a chief physician and many scribes. It is presumed that by the late kingdom, every temple had a House of Life. The House of Life offered training for the elite, destined for occupations such as astronomers, doctors, veterinarians, diplomats, architects, translators, or theologians. Some institutions focused on specific disciplines, making them a central hub for the country. Not limited to instruction for young students, the House of Life was a source of reference for many scholars, with rooms dedicated to papyri of many disciplines. Because papyri were preserved there, the Greco-Romans referred to the House of Life as a library. Ancient Egyptian economy was based on an unequal system of redistribution of goods. The state of Egypt collected the crops, and the temples distributed them throughout the provinces. Since the only people capable of counting and ensuring a fair redistribution were the educated scribes, this meant that the temples played a pivotal role in this process. There are records of pharaohs making offerings of large tracts of land and animals to temples in order to maintain their favor. Ramses III offered generous gifts to the Temple of Amun in Karnak in such a manner. Palaces, warehouses, and granaries were built inside the temple compound to better control the redistribution of goods. The size of the recorded numbers of goods, combined with every other function filled by temples, only serves to confirm their might as economic, religious, and political centers of power within Egypt.
¿Dónde está el meme que iba a buscar, boludo? Ah, sí. En LOL aljibar. Una ventilador, tío. A ver, la construcción en Egipto.
Welcome to Building Ancient Egypt. Constructed with bricks made of mud, most ancient Egyptian buildings were not permanent. Only religious temples and funerary monuments were meant to stand the ravages of time. For these very important structures, Egyptians used limestone, sandstone, and harder materials, such as granite, quartzite, and travertine. These heavy stone blocks were so prized that they were often transported from quarries located hundreds of kilometers away. Limestone was common and easy to extract from quarries on the east bank of the Nile. This particular limestone had marine fossils in it, however, preventing it from being easily decorated and polished. Used as the main building material, the structure would then be finished with a finer limestone that was polished smooth and decorated as needed. Limestone was used for the building of the first pyramids, and for most of the religious buildings of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Ancient Egyptians preferred to use sedimentary rock beds, or layers like sandstone and limestone, because they were often easier to extract. The common method used to extract stone was the open pit quarry. Stonecutters would find quality stone, shape, and dig it out on site. Open pit quarries enabled many workers to work simultaneously on many blocks, which allowed for better productivity. Workers would draw a large grid directly on the stone's surface, taking care to leave a space between the blocks. This allowed them to isolate the different blocks and create a trench that would make the extraction easier. Stoneworkers used iron chisels for hard rock and bronze or copper tools for softer rocks such as limestone. Removing material between each block created a trench line. In some quarries, that trench was wide enough to accommodate a worker, who would then cut the block entirely on site. For harder rocks like granite, workers cut a series of holes and hammered wooden wedges into them. They then soaked the wood until it swelled and caused the rock to split. The gallery extraction technique was used when the desired rock was buried under layers of rubble. This method was often necessary in order to find the whiter and finer limestone required for a smoother finish. The first step was for the stoneworkers to create an access pit that would allow them to reach the desired wall of stone. Once a wall of quality stone was exposed, workers could then cut out smaller blocks. This pit required a descending platform. Designed like a stairway, it allowed them to free multiple galleries of blocks. To cut the stone, they created a longitudinal kerf, or slit, and then cut the rock at a 90-degree angle. The lower side was determined along the geological layers or by using a horizontal cut. Wooden wedges were inserted in the rock and hammered in. Shock waves were then generated using hammers, fracturing the blocks at the seam. To maintain the stability of these mining pits over the course of quarrying, workers would leave support sections of unexcavated rock. In every quarry, dedicated shrines were established to offer protection for the workers. In particular, Serket, the scorpion goddess, was considered a very powerful deity among quarry workers. Every mine and quarry of ancient Egypt included a scorpion charmer who was said to use magical powers to ward off the dangerous insects and keep the workers safe.
Welcome to Work. Whether workers were employed for the pyramid construction or at the quarries, the government supplied food and housing. Workers for the pyramids and royal necropolises were housed in more permanent villages, such as the famous Deir el-Medina. quarry workers had more temporary lodgings. All skill levels were needed and utilized, from basic work hands to prepare the gypsum, to brickmakers and sand carriers, to skilled stonemasons to shape the blocks. Skilled architects and engineers were employed year-round, while support labor were often farmers who worked on the quarries or construction during the Nile's flood season. The basic laborers were hardworking and versatile. Many may have been farmers who joined the construction during the off-season. Hieroglyphs found in the work villages listed assigned job titles. Archaeological research shows that no food was stored or prepared on site, but instead workers received abundant rations of bread, beer, and meat. These rations were taken care of by an administration outside the village. Medical treatment was also available for those who were injured. While some quarries were close to the Nile, others were located across the desert and required long expeditions. These expeditions were sanctioned by the state. They involved complex logistics and required many participants. Transporting a block by land meant that workers had to overcome the weight and friction of the load. To solve this, they first dug a track in the ground. This path was sometimes reinforced with rails upon which a sled, used to ferry the blocks, would be pulled. Whenever possible, blocks were toppled from a higher elevation onto the sled. Workers then poured water onto the clay at the front of the sled, creating a slick surface to more easily move the load. It wasn't until the New Kingdom that animals were used to tow the burden. Whenever possible, blocks were toppled from a higher elevation onto the sled. Workers then poured water onto the clay at the front of the sled, creating a slick surface to more easily move the load. It wasn't until the New Kingdom that animals were used to tow the burden. During flood season, the Nile was at its largest and deepest, which allowed the transportation of the heaviest and biggest loads. Quarries close to the river had troughs dug out to deliver the stones to the shoreline. Harbors and wharfs situated at the river's edge allowed the transfer of materials and supplies. Harbor warehouses accommodated additional stocks of stone so that they were available for the winter sailing season.
Hay que ver esto, pero bueno. No, nos dijeron que podemos poner en esto. No sé. Una pirámide de una.
The Uwadi al-Jarf Papyri detail a limestone load intended for the Khufu pyramid that weighed in at 70 to 80 tons, or 30 blocks. One papyrus is a fragment from a foreman's notes, taken while working on the Great Pyramid. It details the transportation of limestone blocks from the Tura quarries to the construction site of the pyramid. The other papyri are shipping logs containing archives of the sailors assigned to sail the Red Sea and the Nile. Stone cargo generally weighed 15 tons per boat, amounting to roughly 6 or 7 blocks per trip. For heavier loads such as obelisks, monolithic pillars, or gigantic statues, larger boats were used. These transports are the ones typically showcased on temple walls.
Estamos haciendo acá con lo que venimos haciendo de la vida diaria pero ya casi, o sea, nos quedan como 10, un poco más tal vez, pero es eso.
River transportation was the most efficient way to ferry stone blocks between the quarry and the construction site. Blocks were transported by flotillas of several types of boats. The most detailed illustration of transport by river is a relief of Queen Hatshepsut's barge with an accompanying flotilla.
A ver, nos quedan exactamente... Estornudo reveal. Nos quedan más de 10. Nos quedan 3 más 3, 6, 3 más 3, 9... Bueno, sí. 6, 9, 10, 12. 12 tangas. Conoce las técnicas agrícolas básicas del antiguo Egipto porque nunca tenía pues. Es muy probable que mañana, si terminamos estas 12 estaciones hoy, vamos a empezar Horizon Zero Dawn. Porque tengo la edición completa y hasta que me den los DLC de Assassin's Creed son un mes. Ahora, no sé, mayo el 17 voy a tener que esperar un mes, así que bastante tiempo. Conoce la tienda de
Welcome to Agriculture and Seasons. While crops were cultivated in different oases around the desert, most of the arable lands were near the Nile. 2 types of cereal grain were cultivated, barley and an ancient wheat known as emmer. These 2 key ingredients contributed in establishing bread and beer as the staple of the Egyptian diet and the basis of its economy.
Era parte de su cosa, su vida diaria, boludo, épico. Tengo problemas ahora que Bruno Cortés. Hola amigo, ¿cómo estás? Pareció ser nuevo, ¿no? En el canal, nunca te vi antes, por lo menos en los comentarios. Bueno, te voy a hacer la pregunta que le hago siempre a todas las personas que se conectan por primera vez a mis directos. ¿Cómo es que descubriste este directo? ¿Cómo es que encontraste este video de este canal con tan escasos suscriptores?
The Ptolemaic era created an agricultural revolution with the introduction of advanced agricultural techniques and new grain types such as rice, durum wheat, and pearl millet. The resulting agricultural mass production greatly increased the economy of ancient Egypt. It also prompted the development of storage and transportation, allowing long-distance trade with other regions.
Tipo, yo, o sea, mis viejos hacen milanesa de mi hijo a veces. Y como, a mí me gusta, tipo, es como re raro. A ver. Como estoy todo bien, amigo. Ahora mismo lo que estamos haciendo es que igual, o sea, lo habrán visto ya, pero estamos jugando Assassin's Creed Origins. Aún así, no estamos jugando el modo de juego principal. Realmente estamos jugando a un modo de juego que se llama Descubrimiento. Asumo que lo conocerás, pero incluso si no lo conoces, es básicamente... es el juego normal, pero todo distinto. Creo que es la peor explicación que di en mi vida. Básicamente te vas pasando por los puntos más icónicos del mapa en los que te explican la historia de Egipto. Y Y en la historia de Egipto se incluye la historia de las pirámides, de los faraones, de los rituales religiosos, de los tipos y las formas de cultivo, de la cultura en general que tenían los egipcios, en fin, un montón de cosas. Y eso, como se puede ver en la parte que dice pasaporte, ya me los completé casi todos, y cuando complete esto de vida diaria, que me quedan 12, así cuando complete este me van a quedar 12, voy a haber completado, todo lo que tenía para ofrecer este modo de juego. Después de eso, en un mes aproximadamente, cuando me haga con los DLCs de este juego, voy a volver a jugarlo. Pero bueno, es como, si termino esto hoy en todo este stream, este va a ser el último directo de Origins. Después, hasta que llegue el momento en el que tenga sus DLC, voy a jugar otros juegos, obvio. La compa aquí, no se escucha bien. Sí, lo sé, amigo. Mira, o sea, mi micrófono... Es bueno mi micrófono, el problema es que está roto, tipo... Mira, yo tengo el auricular y tiene un cable como de 1000 metros, tiene como 3 metros de largo. Y el problema es que al ser tan largo se me enredan todas las partes del cuerpo. Y hace no muy poco, hace no mucho, me pasó que estaba sentado, me paré de la silla y me fui al baño, que está acá atrás, no sé si fui a mear o qué hacer. Y cuestión que camino y escucho un terrible, así como ¡pah! En el piso. Y resulta que el auricular del ojete estaba enganchado a una partecita de mi sandalia. Y entonces, bueno, se cayó toda la mierda y el micrófono se me desenganchó, tipo... Ahora está el micrófono normal, pero está colgando de un cable. ¿Y qué pasa? Yo para solucionar eso, entre comillas, pegué el micrófono a una parte del auricular. Y bueno, así es como se mantiene ahí andando. Pero bueno, si está muy lejos de mi boca y por eso anda tan mal. No, amigo, no te preocupes, está perfecto que lo preguntes así. Yo preguntaría lo mismo, si en un directo se escucha tan mal. Porque bueno, tal vez se lo preguntaría porque tal vez no lo sabe y lo puede solucionar. A ver, y bueno, nada, ahora lo que estamos haciendo es viendo las paradas. Yo generalmente me pongo a leer todas las paradas porque me interesa lo que dicen. A ver, sí. Que son esos especie de monumento.
Both bread and beer rations were part of a system of barter payment. The state used those goods to pay wages for those who worked in the quarries and at the construction sites. Beer was so important to ancient Egyptians, they had a goddess of beer brewing, Tenenet. Tenenet is seen in many paintings and sculptures with beer, and women are depicted as the primary beer makers.
Me pregunto cuál era la edad normal a la que se podía empezar a tomar cerveza en ese entorno. Los 15. Es como en muchos países cambia todo ese tema. Acá universalmente, por así decirlo, suele ser 18. Pero no en mi caso, yo no empecé a tomar, tengo 15, no empecé a tomar todavía.
In order to increase agricultural production, fertile land was divided into plots and large agricultural villages were encouraged. The state and temples were the biggest landowners. Depending on the region, fertile land was managed by civil servants or rented to individuals. Ancient Egyptians relied on rudimentary tools for land cultivation. Soil was broken down with hoes, and wing plows were used to make furrows.
el juego que ahora mismo estoy jugando se llama Assassin's Creed Origins. Así tal cual, es un nombre un poco largo. Aún así, te digo, esto no es como... Es una especie de expansión del juego principal. Es decir, vos en el juego principal estás con este peladito y es como mucho más divertido. Es decir, bueno, supongo que depende de tus gustos, pero acá estás más que nada formándote acerca de la cultura egipcia, por distintos lugares del juego y cosas del estilo. Y en el juego principal, la historia que me cuenta tiene una historia muy distinta. Peleas contra una orden, tenés que visitar lugares, tenés que, no sé, coleccionables, resolver acertijos. Además de que Assassin's Creed es como uno de los tantos juegos que pertenece a una gran saga, en mi opinión. Así que sí, es como una expansión en la que te explican cosas.
The three seasons known as Akhet, Peret, and Shemu corresponded to a specific phase of the agricultural process and the river's natural changes. Akhet was the time of the flood, beginning with the appearance of the star Sirius in July. Peret was the time when lands were cultivated, plowed, and sown. This fell between October and November. Shemu ran from May to September and was when harvesting and taxation began.
iguales a Sphinx, creo que también es Winnowing. No, claro, tanto puede pelear. Épico, por ejemplo, un juego principal los poderes te cagan, aparte, o las matas o te matan. Bueno, mi internet lo dejó bien, así que puede que en algunos días no estén directos. Qué lástima, amigo, eso de que internet te vaya mal, debe ser una mierda. Más encima vos vas a la escuela, ¿no? Es decir, bueno, por lo menos en mi caso es todo virtual. Internet siempre es un gran problema a la hora de hacer clases. Pero bueno, por mí no tengo presión, digo. Yo siempre voy a estar acá.
The pharaoh's duty was to uphold order against chaos and provide for his people. Priests and local governors also wanted to appear as protectors of the people. However, any variation in the Nile's seasons could cause water shortages. This had devastating consequences on wheat and barley crops. The pharaoh, administrators, and priests knew they needed to demonstrate their ability to prevent such a catastrophe from happening. And so they invented the story, which would be inscribed upon the famine stela.
Gracias, Bruno Cortes, por esa suscripción. Aunque igual, como se lo dije a Uguani y probablemente a todas las personas que alguna vez estuvieron en mis directos de este canal, no sé qué cosa haría que ustedes, haría que a ustedes les guste directos. Es decir, yo es como, me la paso leyendo, hablo alguna que otra cosa, pero nunca digo nada muy importante ni divertido, pero bueno. Hey, si querés estar acá, me parece perfecto. Gracias por la suscripción, amigo. Es como raro porque se me suscriben muchísimas personas que no conozco y que son muy distintas a las unas de nosotras. A pesar de que quienes en el pasado se suscribieron no estén en el directo, es decir, no sé, me sorprende mucho eso. Como hay etapas. Ya lo dije en el directo.
The story begins with the pharaoh worried for his people. The Nile hasn't flooded in years, and his people are starving. In search of the origins of the flooding, Djoser seeks out Khnum, the protector god of the region and the source of the drought. Djoser gives the god offerings and orders his priests to restore the Temple of Khnum. These offerings please the god, and the floods are restored. This story was intended to highlight the importance of the deity in everyone's daily lives, while also demonstrating the crucial role that the priests and the king played in feeding and protecting the people of Egypt.
Claro, ahí está la historia, mira. ¡Fua! Le escribieron en roca. Qué lo profundo que es este río. Porque claro, no olvidemos que es un río, boludo. Perdón, corté la corte emotiva, pero es que bueno, lo escuché mil veces yo, boludo. Como LOL. A ver, cultivos del Antiguo Egipto. Nomo de Canopo conoce las técnicas de cultivo del Antiguo Egipto. No lo vimos ya. O sea, ¿qué es lo que vimos antes si no es eso? Bueno, yo en un rato igual voy a ver si llego a terminar todos los recorridos, pero como tengo que ir a hacer tarea, como ya tengo problemas. O sea, 18 suscriptores. Acumulo 717 vistas.
Welcome to Ancient Egyptian. The new grain types of the Ptolemaic period required a great deal of water. Farmers needed to ensure they had effective, consistent irrigation. The Nile's rising and receding waters naturally irrigated most of the crops. Areas where the Nile didn't reach, such as gardens and vegetable plots, required an irrigation tool known as the shadoof. The shadoof allowed easy transport of water from its source. It consisted of a tall wooden frame with a long pivoting pole and suspended bucket. The system could be raised and lowered with little effort. Later, a sakya, or water wheel, was invented. The sakya needed animals to turn the wheel, which rotated buckets through the water. It drew the water to an elevation of 3.5 meters and enabled a great deal of control over the irrigation process. This improvement supplied larger areas and thus resulted in larger harvests. The threshing process separated the grain from its husk. Workers would spread the ears on clean ground. Oxen, cows, or donkeys were then guided back and forth to trample the grain. This continuous movement worked the grain loose while preventing the animals from eating it. Unwanted chaff and straw were swept away, or gathered and added to the mud used to make bricks, to make them stronger. Winnowing was the stage where workers used wooden scoops to throw ears in the air. The wind carried off the chaff, leaving the heavier seeds to fall to the ground. This action was repeated until the undesired materials were sifted out. Grain waste was mixed with manure or other organic substances to produce brick-shaped dung loaves that could be easily burned. A standardized brick size enabled Egyptians to mass-produce this byproduct and use it as a commodity. Transporting large amounts of grain required ships equipped to carry heavy loads. These goods were moved during the Nile's flooding season, when the river was deep enough for large ships. The transports stopped at checkpoints to accommodate customs and police controls, as well as for technical requirements and weather conditions.
Che, ay, espera, estamos en el lomo de canopo. Eso es el hipódromo. La biblioteca de Alejandría. No, era el hipódromo. Concha la hora, boludo. Seleccioné antes. Claro, no, ya está.
Having reached Alexandria's inner harbor, the wheat was unloaded under the supervision of a civil servant in charge of wheat management. Portions were distributed to Alexandria's city market, and the remaining stockpile was either exported or stored in warehouses.
Claro, es decir, el resto se exportaba. Lo principal, o sea, el principal uso de lo que cultivaban era para usarlo en ellos mismos, boludo. De esa manera tenían la mejor calidad de cultivos ellos. En Argentina lo mejor que tenemos es el comercio. Puta madre. Compramos carne como si fuese de otros países. Una vez en el puerto interior de Alejandría, se grababa bajo la supervisión de un funcionario de puesto de... Ya. Se ve que son estas pelotitas redonditas,
Grain storage facilities were located across all of Egypt.
Sí.
Temples and institutions had large silos, while individual houses had storage sheds. In some houses, arched cellars were built into the foundations. These watertight chambers were accessible from the ground floor through a trapdoor. Royal granaries acted as the storehouse and distribution centers and managed state payments to civil servants, soldiers, and the police. Though plastered on the inside, silos weren't completely sealed and so remained susceptible to mice infestations.
La baja es. Amigos, si en algo se esforzaron fue en renderizar el trigo, boludo, mirá. Bastante bien, o sea, se ve la mala, una calidad mala, pero no sé qué tanto esta piedra.
When the grain was ready for processing, it was poured into bowls and pounded into a coarse flour. That flour was then passed through a sieve to make it of finer quality and further ground between stones. Ancient Egyptians did not stock flour. Instead, fresh grain was portioned out each time to produce flour as it was needed. The sieves used by ancient Egyptians were unable to filter out sand and stones. Grit often passed into the flour, causing long-term tooth abrasions among all classes of Egyptians.
Ahora sí nos quedan 10. Animales domesticados. Ya no tengo que no se representan nada. Y probablemente perros. No sé si tal vez. Los gatos eran animales sagrados, no los domesticaban. 206 likes. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Quién sacó esa foto? Tantos likes. Bueno, también lo dejo. Pero ¿por qué? ¿Qué pasó? Entiendo, ¿por qué? Yo con mi valle curso de acá re contento. Este no es valle. No, de acá, valle curso. ¿Qué hacemos en Fallón, boludo? Estamos hablando del orto acá. Pero ¿por qué no se guardan la foto del juego principal?
Welcome to Domesticated Animals of Ancient Egypt. Agriculture and domesticated livestock were introduced 6,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found traces of cattle, donkeys, pigs, and dogs. Dromedary are thought to have been introduced during the Persian invasion. Pets were deeply cherished in ancient Egypt. Many illustrations of children often include a pet in the depiction. One of ancient Egypt's most iconic animals, the cat, wasn't adopted into their daily life until the Middle Kingdom. Since they were so highly capable of killing snakes and rodents, cats were present throughout every period. However, they only became pets sometime during the Middle Kingdom. Prince Thutmose, son of Amenhotep III, had his cat Tamu laid to rest in its own sarcophagi.
Eso dicen que no hay si cambio. Ahora que ver. Ahora estamos haciendo tanto.
The earliest reference to dogs dates back to 5000 BCE. They were popular pets as they helped hunters and protected herds. They were closely linked to Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Baboons, monkeys, and even falcons were tamed as pets. Each was mummified and buried with as much ceremony as any family member.
Medicina del Antiguo Egipto. Profundiza en el equilibrio entre magia y ciencia que caracterizó la medicina del Antiguo Egipto. Magia. Cuesta leer ciencia con magia. ¿Para qué lo cuesta ciencia, religión? Dios. Magia. No, para qué
Welcome to Ancient. Evidence of advanced medical procedures have been found on mummies, and ancient Egyptians left detailed medical writings from diagnosis to follow-up treatment. One of the oldest known surgical studies is the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It's one of the first documents in history that notes an association between the integrity of the brain and cognitive functions, including cases of ocular complications and paralysis following head trauma. Vinegar-treated marble stone from Memphis was used as an anesthetic.
Erwin Smith sobre el Attack on Titan, pero ahora es Erwin.
Another similar document, the Ebers Medical Papyrus, is over 20 meters long and 30 centimeters wide. It details treatments of 48 surgical cases and contains 877 paragraphs describing various diseases. Alongside accurate and factual scientific approaches, the papyrus has more than 700 magic formulas and incantations to ward off demons and disease. This demonstrates how ancient Egyptians believed in a harmonious balance between religion and science. Remedies were considered as medicine and carried by doctors and priests. Village doctors often had another job alongside their medical duties and the preparation of medicines. A cure for blindness was made of fermented honey, ochre, and coal. The science behind it was that honey functioned as an antiseptic and antibacterial, while ochre would reduce the swelling. All of their knowledge did not always suffice. Ramses II died of an infection caused by an abscessed tooth.
No. ¿En serio? Fa. Los profesores de medicina y los demás médicos de... A ver. Descubre más sobre los usos del cuero y del lino en el antiguo Egipto. Cuero y lino, ok. No, se fue el autor. Reinas. Bueno, faraona. O sea, eran reinas las esposas del faraón. No, no sé.
Welcome to Leather and Linen in Ancient Egypt.
Era eso.
Tanning, a process which dates from prehistoric times, was present although not highly valued in Egypt due to the heat. Leather was reserved mainly for things such as sandals, leather bags, dagger sheaths, quivers, and other similar items. Leopard hides, unlike regular leather, were highly valued and usually worn by priests. Valued for its coolness and freshness in hot weather, linen was the fiber most commonly used for fabrics and textiles. It was produced from flax, which was plentiful in Egypt. Fibers were usually dyed before weaving. While color was used in the production of textiles, dyes weren't commonly used for clothing, and most Egyptians wore white. The color represented spiritual purity, a goal to reach for every day of one's mortal life.
Big ayevcimiz. Yuim aynek. Samet her hidi abtu. Pete esis rui.
Veamos de otra. Se me va a sentar ese comentario, pero buenísimo.
Various shades were achieved using woad, a dye produced from the leaves of Isotis tinctoria. The plant was cultivated for this purpose within the Nile Delta and allowed for the creation of various colors. For example, different maceration times of the leaves would result in colors ranging from red to green, while adding in limestone shifted it to blue. During the Greco-Roman period, other ingredients were found, resulting in a wider range of colors. This area's style is strongly influenced by the dye baths and tanneries of modern-day Fes in Morocco. This helped Ubisoft envision what such locations might have been like in ancient Egypt. While this tannery is within the city walls, back then they were often found outside the city boundaries. The tanner's trade was considered off-putting by the Greeks, as all these operations resulted in noxious smells.
Mira si se ve. Fa. Mira, boludo. A ver. La moda del antiguo Egipto, ¿conoces la moda? Del antiguo Egipto.
Welcome to Ancient Egyptian Fashions. Learning what life was like for ancient Egyptians presents many differences, and yet also surprising similarities to how people might live today. Understanding the daily lives of regular citizens so many thousands of years ago is ultimately what connects us as human beings. Jewelry was a popular item among ancient Egyptians of all social standing. Both men and women wore earrings, rings, and bracelets. Status determined how much jewelry a person wore and what it was made of. Common folk wore pearl necklaces, simple bracelets, and leather bangles. Brightly colored earthenware and glass paste were a favorite enhancement.
Tumba cubana. Oh. Abajo de la mesa. La mesa se para, no se sienta. En la mesa, digo, en la mesa, en la mesa no se para, tampoco se sienta. En la mesa. Pero es un chabón, boludo.
The jewelry of the elite was made from gold, silver, and other precious stones. Because gold never lost its shine, it was considered akin to the flesh of the gods. Wide jeweled collars were a favorite. Made with rows of beads formed into patterns of animals or flowers, the soft chiming sounds they made were thought to appease the gods. Though idealized, tomb paintings are a catalog of the changing fashions of ancient Egypt from the Old to the New Kingdom. Egyptians took appearance and cleanliness very seriously and were diligent about their fashion, hair, and jewelry, as well as their grooming habits. The fabric of ancient Egyptian clothing was almost entirely made from various grades of linen. Linen was commonly white, draped over the body, and cinched at the waist, though some garments were sewn or tailored. Wealthy men wore long tunics, loincloths, or kilts, while poor men only wore loincloths. Women wore long dresses, with differences residing in the quality of the fabric, depending on social status. Egyptians commonly went barefoot, but could also wear sandals made from papyrus fiber or leather. Cosmetics, including concoctions to prevent body odor and bad breath, were an integral part of everyday life for Egyptians. Used by both men and women, cosmetics were used as moisturizing ointments and sun protection as much as for beautification. Red ochre, a natural clay, was the most readily available cosmetic to tint lips and cheeks. Henna was used on nails and lips, and as hair coloring. It was also favored by richer women to decorate their palms and the soles of their feet. Egyptians believed coal had magical powers, wearing it as black eyeliner to protect their eyes from the sun and to prevent eye infections from particles in the flooded Nile River. A special green coal, made from ground malachite, was worn for ceremonies and religious rituals. Women and teenage girls wore their hair long and often braided. Wealthier women included carved combs or hairpins. The length of men's hair rarely dropped past the shoulders. They were mostly clean-shaven during the dynastic period, a trend began by the elite and soon adopted by the general populace. Queen Hatshepsut donned an artificial beard when she became pharaoh. Wigs were very popular, used for special occasions or to conceal gray hair or baldness. They were fastened in place with beeswax. The most expensive wigs were made from human hair and reserved for royalty. Other wigs were composed of linen, wool, or animal hair. Prepubescent children generally had their heads shaved. Young girls kept some strands intact, while young boys had a braid worn on the side. Welcome to... It was under the watchful eye of Ta of Memphis, the god of craft and architecture, that ancient Egyptians developed the unique rendition of the world they lived in. However, it is vital to understand that their view of art, and those who created it, was likely very dissimilar to the modern concept of the word. Instead of artists, the creative culture had skilled and respected artisans. The most significant categories of specialties for crafters were drawing, painting, sculpture, and metalworking. Ancient Egyptian craftspeople created both art and a wide variety of mundane, everyday tools. Every item created had a specific purpose and was produced by anonymous artisans who worked alone or with a team. Most crafts, such as pottery and metalworking, were utilized for everyday items. Luxury goods and artwork illustrations served temple rituals and were not meant for public display. Artisans rarely signed their names to the work, though they were clearly aware that they possessed a unique skill and talent for the task. Ancient Egyptian craftspeople created both art and a wide variety of mundane, everyday tools. Art, in all its forms, has offered not only a practical insight into the way ancient Egyptians lived, but in how they viewed the world and their place in it. The balance of order and chaos was crucial in both the physical and the metaphysical universes. As a result, their art appears to follow a strict set of stylistic conventions that supported this worldview. From households and palaces to temples and tombs, pottery, papyrus, and textile items were essential to the everyday life of ancient Egyptians. In ancient Egyptian culture, drawing was used as illustration, such as seen in the Book of the Dead. It was also the first step in the creation of a relief, painting, or statue. Two-dimensional representations were concerned with order and form, and were intended to honor gods and promote the transition of the soul to the afterlife. Stylistically, Egyptians were concerned with the depiction of the human form's inner self. As such, artistic representations were not concerned with realism, but rather with idealized youth and perfectly harmonious visuals. An exception to this were scenes depicting hunting and battle, where the environment and enemies moved in lively, even chaotic ways. Animals and foes were depicted piled up, as if describing chaos, with Egyptians standing in solemn, disciplined poses, bringing order to the scene. Reliefs could be either in high relief or low relief. Either method required a surface suited to the desired technique. Preparation of the surfaces differed depending on the quality of the rock. A quarried block only needed a simple smoothing. Rough-cut rock monuments, such as those found in tombs, required more work. Often the surface was coated in plaster before being sculpted. An exception to this were scenes depicting hunting and battle, where the environment and enemies moved in lively, even chaotic ways. Animals and foes were depicted For reliefs, preliminary sketches were drawn in red, then framed with a red grid to position the elements of the scenes. Corrected sketches were in black, and once approved, the scene was ready to be carved. This method likely explains the name given to relief makers, the one who draws the outlines. Reliefs could be either in high relief or low relief. Either method required a surface suited to the desired technique. Preparation of the surfaces differed depending on the quality of the rock. A quarried block only needed a simple smoothing. Rough-cut rock monuments. Statues were believed to be vessels for the souls of the deceased, or deities. That is why a sculptor was called the one who makes it live. This divine duty earned them the utmost respect. As with a relief, creation of a sculpture began with a drawing. Most statues were made of quarried blocks of stone, primarily limestone, though sometimes harder stones such as quartzite were also used. Statues were believed to be vessels for the souls of the deceased, or deities. That is why a sculptor... In ancient Egypt, the profession of crafter was organized and relied on a specific hierarchy. Most artisans depended on an institution to provide them with raw materials. There were 3 working levels for craftsmanship: domestic, large estates, and within palace and temple workshops. Some royal workshops, at their largest, covered an area of about 2.8 square kilometers in size. At the domestic level, most Egyptians were craftspeople to a greater or lesser extent. The ability to repair tools was a daily necessity. Crafted everyday items could also be bartered for at the local market. Artisans with skills but lacking in resources worked at large estates, where the elite provided them with space to work and raw materials. The most skilled artisans were employed in royal or temple projects and benefited from a special status. They were provided with good workspaces and considered to be highly skilled. An ancient text known as the Satires of Trades has a number of descriptive summaries that offer teasing glimpses into how artisans were perceived. A coppersmith was said to stink and have fingers that resembled crocodile droppings, while potters were said to be like those who lived in bogs. This view was likely exaggerated in order to highlight the most enviable position of all, that of the scribe. An ancient text known as the Satires of Trades has a number of descriptive summaries that offer teasing glimpses into how artisans were perceived. A coppersmith was said to stink and have fingers that resembled crocodile droppings, while potters were said to be like those who lived in bogs. This view was likely exaggerated. Located near the Valley of the Kings, Deir el-Medina was a settlement created by order of the king to honor the most skilled artisans. Its name translates as the Monastery of the City. Allocated a house on the initiative of the king, these craftsfolk were regarded with respect and referred to as the royal artisans. Those who lived there worked on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and its surrounding temples. Archaeologists believe the site was home to skilled and respected artisans for over 400 years. It is considered one of the most important discoveries relating to Egyptian daily life. While much of the focus of Egyptian archaeology was on its kings and queens, it wasn't until the excavation of Deir el-Medina that Egyptologists were given a valuable window into the community life of ancient Egyptian artisans.
Cronología, pasaporte de la puta madre. Ok, sigo. Por el culo de la alfarería en Antiguo Egipto. Conoce más sobre la alfarería y sus distintos usos en Antiguo Egipto. Ok. Voy a mirar, ok. Ya vuelvo.
Welcome to Evolution of Pottery in Ancient Egypt. Excavations all over Egypt have uncovered enormous quantities of pottery vessels of all shapes and sizes. The production of pottery was mainly confined to the outskirts of settlements due to the materials required and to keep the kiln smoke away from inhabited spaces. The function of the product determined the selection of the raw material, its treatment, its form, as well as the finishing of the surface. Pottery was essential to ancient Egyptians' daily lives. It was used in all aspects of life, from the storage of grains and liquids to containers within the tombs of necropolises. The most common pottery was made from Nile silt that resulted in a reddish-brown clay. Limestone clay, which made for more attractive pottery, was only found in Upper Egypt. Early pots were made from pinched or coiled clay. Chopped straw, ashes, and other minerals were added, and the mixture was then smoothed and decorated before being put in the oven. Pots were fired in bonfires or enclosed within a brick kiln.
No, ma no sabía.
The potter's wheel was utilized during the Old Kingdom. Pottery became smoother and more polished, similar to river stones. It was decorated primarily in red pigment, with the black color achieved by exposing it to smoke. Pottery workshops were attached to palaces or temples, and around the late period, specialized workshops began to appear. Quartzite particles which created the rich blue or green glazing, became common during the New Kingdom. Mediterranean motifs and tin-based glazing came with the Greco-Roman era. Potsherds could be found anywhere and were the most common canvas for writing or drawing, in comparison to the more expensive papyrus sheets. Named after their Greek description, ostraca contained daily life records, letters, or could be drawn upon. Artists drew sketches for temples and tombs, or simply for leisure.
Sé que soy una egipcia, conoce la vida familiar de los hogares del antiguo Egipto. Vamos, el tumor de 3.
Welcome to the Egyptian household. In pre-Greco-Roman culture, women were considered equal to men in many matters. They owned property, testified in court, could divorce and inherit. Until the Greeks and Romans restricted their rights, Egyptian women could take over their deceased husband's trade. Marriage contracts included mentions of allowances and items of value brought to the marriage by the woman, which would forever belong to her. Certain professions were open only to women, such as weaving or professional mourning, while others were available to both genders, including working as servants for the rich households. Social status did have an impact, though. The higher in status, the easier it was to obtain education and access different professions.
Aha بالطاوة قف هيري ونفير هير جهبي خط يير
Homes were generally composed of 3 rooms. First, there was the entrance, furnished with a small bench of brick, probably intended for a statue and protective divinity. Then there was the ceremonial room, meant to receive guests. The last room was either a bedroom or kitchen. Furniture consisted of basic chairs, chests, and storage. Tables were not used for family dinners. Instead, each individual had a small table of their own. Marriages were a social contract rather than a religious construct. Family was vitally important to ancient Egyptians, and children were considered a blessing from the gods. The father, mother, and their children were the nucleus of the family, and cohabitation sometimes extended to mothers-in-law, sisters, aunts, and sisters-in-law. Status and wealth played a large role in the style and size of ancient Egyptian homes. Commoners' houses were built with sun-baked mud bricks. Wealthier homes were often painted in white and decorated with various motifs. Town officials and the rich lived in mansions with numerous rooms that were luxuriously decorated. Only temples and tombs meant to last for all eternity were built with stone. Funeral stone inscriptions focused on the main member of a household. Encircling this person would then be a spouse, parents, and children, possibly even siblings. These stones were so structured because there were no surnames in ancient Egyptian culture. Parents and children were a sort of family tree, which allowed for the identification of the deceased. Funeral stone inscriptions focused on the main member of a household. Encircling this person would then be a spouse, parents, and children, possibly.
Pan y cerveza. Conoce los pasos de la fermentación de la cerveza y la producción del pan, así como su importancia para los científicos. Oh, vehículos autónomos.
Welcome to... While the Mesopotamians invented beer, including using a straw to avoid the sediments and herbs, ancient Egyptians perfected the brewing method. Egyptian beer's quality was determined by alcohol's strength, color, and flavor. During the Pharaonic era, beer was the most commonly used and important alcoholic beverage. The state and temples used it, along with bread, as payment to workers, and it was included on the lists of food offerings to the gods and the deceased. Beer was the popular drink of ceremonies and festivals. The Festival of Drunkenness was even dedicated to it. Considered to be quite nutritional, beer was also significant in the day-to-day lives of ancient Egyptians. Egyptian adults and children consumed beer with all of their meals, and medical texts include hundreds of remedies that contain beer. It remained the most popular alcoholic beverage until the Roman era. Recipes for beer varied over time and depended on the quality of the materials. Bakers and brewers typically worked alongside one another at the same workshop or house. Many families often produce the quantity appropriate to their own consumption, with better quality beers produced for festivals and other special occasions. The most basic recipe used malted cereal as the main ingredient. Fruits such as dates were added along with honey and spices. Once baked, bread would be crumbled into the brew to start the fermentation process. Adding grain enzymes would break down the starches, turning them into sugar and creating a thick mash. Once baked, bread would be crumbled into the brew to start the fermentation process. Adding grain enzymes would break down the starches. Once ready, the bread and grain mixture was compressed and then strained through a sieve with water into the mix of malt beer. Once fermented, the beer mash was transferred to large containers and again compressed by foot or with pestles.
Los pies. ¿Imaginas? Manta que solo le traje a una mujer los pies. Esto es una paja de con el pan. La manta remojada se introducía en
Once smooth, the beer was stored in pottery jars and sealed with a clay stopper. It probably couldn't be kept for long and likely had a thick, pasty appearance and texture. Very little was wasted. Leftover grains were reused to make sourdough bread or combined with the next batch of beer. While there are many ancient accounts for making bread, most of the knowledge known about ancient Egyptian brewing comes from an account by the alchemist Zosimus over 300 years after Cleopatra's reign. More recently, Dr. Delwyn Samuel, an archaeobotanist, has proposed alternate antique techniques to brew beer. However, experts are unable to replicate an authentic beer since not all of the techniques and ingredients used by ancient Egyptians are known yet. Food was prepared on the floor until the Middle Kingdom, when cooking benches were introduced. The introduction of durum wheat improved bread quality, meaning that the upper and middle classes ate better. The poor, however, still made do with a diet consisting of a gruel made of vegetables, softened bread, or barley. Dough was kneaded by hand or foot, and when sufficiently blended, additional items were added, such as fruits, nuts, honey, and spices. To leaven the bread, they added sourdough or leaven from beer brewing. Ovens were circular or beehive-shaped and made with clay or brick. If there was no oven at all, a bread maker used the hot sand to bake flatbread, a technique still in use by some Berbers today. Ancient Egyptians always had to fight off the omnipresent sand particles that were blown towards them. Despite their best efforts, sand regularly made its way into their food. Additionally, particles from the grain-grinding stone tools and ovens they used also contributed to attrition and prematurely worn teeth. The team tried to portray this through toothache animations and commoners sweeping sand off.
Ok, dos más. ¿Verdad? Este cortito y este larguísimo. No, parece ser ese es más cortito que el anterior. Vino en el antiguo Egipto. Profundiza en el origen, la producción y el almacenaje de vino en el antiguo Egipto. Let's go. ¿Es igual?
Welcome to Wine in Ancient Egypt. When the god Horus lost his eye in a war with Seth, the ancient Egyptians believed the eye turned into a vine, and the vine's tears became wine. Early texts, dating back to 3150 BCE, contain the hieroglyph for vine. Regarded as extremely valuable, wine was highly sought after by the elite. It was also an essential part of many religious ceremonies. A millennia-old tradition, grape cultivation and wine production was regimented in the way typical of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy. Egyptians kept careful records of winemakers, which they clearly identified on labels. Every landowner with a modicum of self-respect usually kept a vineyard. This held particularly true in the regions of the Fayum and the Nile Delta.
Esto es en las afueras del hipódromo. Sí, pero es Canopo. Sí, man.
Documentation shows that only certain craftsfolk were allowed to provide the containers required to store and transport wine. That and rigorous quality control checks established for every step of wine production shows that ancient Egyptians knew that the quality and longevity of wine could easily be affected by any number of variables, which they paid careful attention to. Egyptians had different kinds of wines, most of which ranged in quality from good to very good. The sweet shadé, to which honey had been added. The soft nejem, obtained by drying the grapes in the sun. The ma, reserved for religious ceremonies. And finally there was the peor, the mediocre-rated wine, resulting from the second pressing of grapes and reserved for a less discerning palate.
El mediocre. Opa, uno dorito. Opa. Aceite, lo que más odio en la vida en el antiguo Egipto. El motivo del uso de aceite negro.
Welcome to Oil in Ancient Egypt. Castor, sesame, and moringa were the source of the most common oils in ancient Egypt. Oil was used for various purposes: cosmetics, medical treatments, nutrition, perfume, athletics, and rituals, to name a few. The team decided to use oil as an explosive to add more gameplay opportunities for the player. Ancient Egyptians originally used castor oil in wick lamps, but also for cosmetics, such as facial and hair treatments. There is mention in some papyrus of castor oil being prescribed to treat constipation and help pregnant women. Castor beans were found in ancient Egyptian tombs as early as 4000 BCE. Castor oil was made by pressing the beans from the plant of the same name. Olive trees were present, though scarce, in ancient Egypt's early history, and olives were mostly imported from Syria and Palestine. Their use and cultivation remained uncommon until the mass arrival of Greek settlers during the reign of the Ptolemies, when demand increased sharply. Olive trees were normally found in the region of the Fayum and the lands surrounding Alexandria.
Yo lo loco. No, has desbloqueado a Zeno Blanca en el modo historia. No sabía que había una recompensa por eso.
Olive trees were present, though scarce, in ancient Egypt's early history, and olives were mostly imported from Syria and Palestine. Their use and cultivation remained uncommon until the mass arrival of Greek settlers during the reign of the Ptolemies, when demand increased sharply. Olive trees were normally found in the region of the Fayum and the lands surrounding Alexandria.
Mirá, amigo, todos, y ahora por eso me dieron a Zeno Blanca, es rarísimo. No sabía que tenía una recompensa así. ¿Ves que era parte de completar el juego al 100%? Vamos, boludo. Gemo de Sigua. ¿Vamos? Ajá, mira. Dale, es una pelota. Juegan re mal, tipo. Mostraban la pelota, mirá, mirá la pelota. Sí, pasame. No, no te la paso, mía. Dale, pasame la salida acá, pero soy aquí. Así no se juega, son buenísimos. A ver. Ahí va, 100% completado el Discovery Tour. Arqueólogo. Ya solo nos quedan esos DLCs. Vamos entonces ahora al juego principal, porque a ver, ya es cierto que ya terminamos, pero parece que ahora tengo una nueva escena, vamos a ponerla. Ahora, vamos a ponerla, se hizo blanca, gente. Se desnegrizó. Lo hizo. Veamos el equipo, gente, que deberíamos de tener muchas cosas LOL. A ver, esperen que no, misión de Reda. Perdón, 28. 29. ¿Estás en blanca? Pa. Esperen, que quiero ver, a ver, necesito ver algo. Comprobar algo. Papararam, bam, bararam, bam, bam, burum, bararam, bum, bararam, bum, bararam, bum, bararam, bum, bararam. Bien, 100% de habilidades desbloqueadas. Ahora sí lo tengo, ¿por qué antes no? ¿Qué? Tengo que... Bueno, está bien. Yo pero tengo el 100% de la gente viola. desprende cosas, boludo. Eso significa que solo el 1.7 de personas que jugó Assassin's Creed tiene seno blanca, porque es decir, bueno, los de Play al menos, porque solo se tiene seno blanca los que completan todos los recorridos del modo de descubrimiento, y estos todos recorridos cuando los completas te dan un trofeo, así que es la cantidad de gente que tiene seno blanca es la misma cantidad de gente que completó ese trofeo, que tiene ese trofeo, y que por ende completó todo el modo del No, ese de con... Va a correr. Ah, por este. Ok, ese era el desafío de la comunidad, ¿no? A ver, espera. Quiero fijarme. ¡Oh, la puta madre! Porque si ese es el coso de la comunidad, hasta la próxima semana no tengo que hacer nada, creo. Vamos a chequearlo. Este coso. Mami. Sí, a ver, vamos a ver. Ah, no, pará, tengo que ir a matar al otro ahora, sí o sí. Para que me sigan dando la recompensa, no sabía. Uy, encima no tengo mucho tiempo. Vamos acá y a este, sí. Una fuerza. Y cuando complete esto voy a ganar algo que se llama Tom Protector. Y voy a ganar, debería, porque estoy tiempo todavía, 7 horas. 7 horas. Ganar el Shield of Horus. Y después de esta semana, la próxima creo, empieza la última. La última semana en la que puedo ganar. Después de eso puedo seguir participando, pero nada voy a ganar. 1935 metros. Espero ganar un Tom Protector como el arma. Porque están. Bueno, claro, porque las armas que ganás son las mierda, solo que Dios sabe. Bueno, a ver, ahí adentro. Pumba. Todo esto y me debería dar una recompensa. Otra más. Son todos iguales, pero varían las características. Me parece que tengo el mejor. ¿Este qué era? Y ahora, a ver, debería de ser juego y su club. Ojalá que sí, poder reclamar, ¿no? La recompensa esta. Ojalá que sí, amigo, porque así ya no me perdería la recompensa y podría hacerlo en la próxima semana el otro desafío. Sí, un premio por recoger. Piola, amigo. Lala, amigo. Sí. Sobre el juego, salir. Ahora, si no, sí. No. Sí. Mirá, un turrilón. Encima me dieron terrible atuendo. Todo bien, boludo. Esperen, a ver. Esperen que vamos a sacar esto. Me queda uno acá. Y una. O sea, la que está marcada en verde es la que. Mirá, amigo, es buenísimo. Es mejor que la cuarta. ¡No! Saludo al matar encima tiene, boludo. Mira, un detector de combo presionizar al matar es buenísimo. Supera por mucho la cuarta clave. Por 3. Y bueno, el mejor combo como para los dioses, sí, es el de 5 flechas y uno veloz. Y este es el mejor de los ligeros, no veloces, son ligeros que tengo. Ese es orden. Ah, qué viola, boludo. Bien. Ah, mal, me olvidé la tonta. Resplandor de nuevo, ¿veis? Bueno, a ver, entonces ahora en la próxima, 90% porque te falta ese bueno, entonces, ahora la próxima semana subí a Sketch of Trust, está del todo bien esto, porque el Assessor of Math, es la comunidad, la recompensa de comunidad que hacías a matar a la, al dios de dificultad de esta semana. Sin embargo, claro, me lo dieron, es decir, yo lo que tendría que haber conseguido era el Shield of Horus. Claro, no esto. Ah, ese es el Shield of Horus. De Shackle es el arma que tengo acá, ¿no? ¿O no? ¿Es esa la que me queda? Porque de estas tengo... No, este es el Shackle, boludo. Extraño, boludo, porque ya me dieron, sí, o sea, completé todos los desafíos, no, me queda uno. Que me debería de quedar uno. Duro Souls of the lo tengo, War Scepter sé que me lo tengo. No Protector Amit sí lo acabo de conseguir. Pero de las cosas tengo todas. Sun Layer es... ¿Cuál arma era? Porque me la olvidé, a ver. Claro, es la que era igual a la espada de la Duat. La traducción sería alguna como Soul Destruction, no sé, destructora de soles, Sun Destroyer, Sun Slayer. Hasta soles, claro, es esta. Qué extraño, boludo. No tengo todas las recompensas de comunidad. Sin embargo, no tengo unas recompensas que sí debería de tener. The Skills of Truth y Shackle's Case no lo tengo, no, eso no. Son arcos que no los tengo. Y para eso tendré que esperar. No sé, es raro que tenga todo, pero no eso. sé, tendré que esperar para conseguirlos. Creo que para la próxima semana, ni idea. La verdad que ni... Dios. Claro, yo vi justo la hora, en unas... Mañana, no, pasado se va a actualizar el desafío y ahí voy a tener que jugar de nuevo, parece ser. Loco. Bueno, de momento entonces tenemos todo hecho de Assassin's Creed Origins. No hay cosa que podamos hacer ahora que no lo hayamos hecho del juego. Así que de momento nada. Ahora me iría a jugar Horizon Zero Dawn. El problema es que tengo que primero hacer tarea. Mañana tengo una prueba, quiero estudiar algo. Y bueno. Así que definitivamente no puedo ahora mismo. Pero bueno. Chicos. Nos vemos. Probablemente mañana. Probablemente mañana. Chao.